Greetings and welcome. The name of the show is The First Amendment, Historically Speaking, and I am your host, Frederick Douglass Dixon. I would like to thank UPTV for giving us this small time that we have here today, and I would like to thank the staff and all of those who help on a daily basis. Without the laborers, this would not be possible, so I thank them all. And today, what I would like to discuss is a historical period, and I hope that we can revisit it again because of the time frame. But to get it started today, I would like to look at things that come before and then things that happen and things that come after. So I want to look at a specific historical period that's leading up to Transcendentalism and the Transcendentalist movement. The Transcendentalist movement is right around the 1840s, and we'll go more into that. That is the thought of Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, to be able to mention one lady as well. So that Transcendentalist movement in the 1840s is right around that Boston area, more specifically in Concord, Massachusetts. And I wanted to give a thought about what set up the idea and the atmosphere for Transcendentalism. So I wanted to look to the early 1800s. And in my role as one who is attempting to forward esoteric information, those particular times were looked to as definitely through the period of 1619 through 1865. But this is the time where we saw a lot of changes in different states and changes occurring, anti-slavery movement, things that led up to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a part of the Compromise of 1850. So some of these legal things that were going on during this time were representative, and they were indeed indicative of the times. So being one who understands the idea of forwarding information, then we look to what Dr. John Hope Franklin said, a very wise and perhaps our wisest scholar. And he says the essence of scholarship is truth. So today we will go right into the idea of setting up what led to Transcendentalism. And I have to go no further than that particular area, which is the Boston, Massachusetts area. And we can begin today for this particular thought. Begin in 1829. 1829 was indeed a very, very valuable year for those historians and for those who are not historians. This is not meant to go over your head. This is not meant to shine some light on my ability to connect to names, dates, and veracity. This is to forward this information so that the person who won't pick up a book can understand the importance. Those of you all who don't find history to be as important as I do, and that's not really the idea. For those folks who don't understand, there's a coin term that said those of us who have not mastered our history are bound and doomed to repeat it. So when we talk about 1829, I talk about Boston, Massachusetts, and I talk about David Walker. Mr. David Walker himself was a very serious man, but David Walker goes down in history for the writings that he left. Now, David Walker himself was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. So for those folks who have connections to that area, you can find the likes of David Walker and his travels if you look. But David Walker was known for an appeal that he wrote to colored citizens. And he was born of a free mother and an enslaved father. Some folks say 1785, some folks say 1796. And through the research, I think closer to 1796 is his actual birth date. But he was indeed an abolitionist. David Walker's abolitionist, his thought of being an abolitionist became very, very forward. He became one who was outspoken. And these things don't happen by coincidence or happenstance. This was by design. He was very much so outspoken person. David Walker was known to be a person who would cut clothes, and he was a stylist during that particular time in Boston, Massachusetts. So David Walker wrote what we know as the appeal, David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world. This particular pamphlet was what we can call our first email, our first shout out, our first ability to connect to a thought that was asking for a different charge. David Walker was asking for immediate abolition, not gradual abolition. So if we talk about Boston, Massachusetts, we need to understand, and transcendentalism, we need to understand that for the most part, when you hear about Massachusetts, you hear that they stopped slavery or got rid of slavery the same year the Brits did, 1835, 1836, in that particular time, which is indeed true. But to forward information and to make this clear and tie to veracity, Massachusetts was the very first state to legalize slavery, 1641. So when we connect these things, we want to forward some information that will add to the pot of knowledge. And when we go back to what David Walker talked about and the North Carolina Manumission Society, those particular colonization schemes and those particular thoughts were about gradual emancipation. So I'll read you a quote from what David Walker says. He said, he talked about, and this comes directly from his appeal, he talks about, had you rather not be killed than to be a slave to a tyrant? David Walker was indeed a Christian man. David Walker was indeed a very learned man. And David Walker raised a group of people, and one of the particular people in his tutelage, who fell under his tutelage, well, let's not say his tutelage, let's say his counterpart, was a young lady by the name of Maria Stewart. Maria Stewart was indeed a female version of Malcolm X in the 1830s. So that sounds a bit ironic, kind of like a third twin or a tall midget that does not exist, or maybe even a good Christian slave owner. None of those exist. So when we talk about David Walker, and it would be remiss if we didn't tell the story in its complete circle. It's 120 wisdom, 120 knowledge, and 120 understanding. Those are the degrees. Then we talk about his influence on Maria Stewart, or her influence on him. Now, Maria Stewart in 1833, she's one that's an educator, and she's also one that was fervent about the idea of immediate emancipation. And she called on the black man to stand up for his own right that was given to him from God to be a human. And we'll give you a couple of quotes. One of them that she uses that ties to her immediate intelligence was, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." She also goes on to say, she says, "I would ask, is it blindness of mind or stupidity of soul or the want of education that has caused our men who are now 60 to 70 years of age to never let their hands be raised nor their voices be heard on behalf of their color? Or is it for the fear of offending whites, which we are taught since our earliest infancy?" 1833. Indeed, she sounds very close to a radical voice, and maybe even a radical voice that we have heard before. So prior to the civil rights movement, prior to emancipation, there were people who felt very strong about what should happen. So we go back to David Walker, and we understand that David Walker's appeal was written in 1829. Now, this particular pamphlet in itself was found from Boston to Florida. Now, this particular pamphlet in several states was looked to and deemed to be incendiary. And indeed it was, for those who had the idea of slavery being perpetual forever. So David Walker's appeal was indeed our first connection. It was indeed our first idea of a black man speaking in the terms of immediate emancipation, and also calling for the slaves to use arms to get away under the yoke and the bondage of the transatlantic slave trade. So when you found David Walker's appeal and you got your hands on David Walker's appeal, it could have meant death for the person who had it in there, who had it. So with David Walker and this appeal, what we find is with David Walker's appeal, it was written in such a way that connected back to the idea of how the Constitution was written. It was written in articles and it had a preamble. But David Walker himself, who lived a very short life, David Walker understood the enormity of what he was doing. He understood how this would not necessarily go down in history, but he understood how important it was for this to be able to be written by someone like him. So when you found David Walker's Appeal from Boston to Florida, it was an underground pamphlet. So lots of the black shoremen, lots of those black seamen would carry David Walker's Appeal. And when they would get off the boats and the ships that they worked on and try to enter the towns, after a while, these people in these states that you find from Boston to Florida realized that this pamphlet was getting out. So they understood after a while, because it doesn't take a whole lot to put fear in one group of people who already are enslaved, to find out that these shoremen, these seamen, these black seamen were passing this information along. And it was becoming so very popular that today, when we ask the question of David Walker's connection, and we're moving along chronologically, did Nat Turner in 1831, Southampton County, Virginia, and his insurrection, did David Walker's appeal influence Nat Turner's insurrection? That's an excellent question. Well, I recently asked some scholars who are far wiser than I, and they both of these young men got rid of that notion, disagreed that Nat Turner would have read David Walker's Appeal. Now, I want to go back to David Walker's Appeal and read some of these quotes from David Walker's Appeal just to show you in 1829 how very severe his thought was. Now, we explained to you how this particular pamphlet was found all over the eastern shores of the United States. Having traveled over a considerable portion of the United States and having in the course of my travels taken the most accurate observation of things as they exist, the result of my observations has warranted the full and unshaken conviction that we, the colored people in the United States, are the most degraded, wretched, and abject set of beings ever lived since the world began. So now he sets this up. This is the intro paragraph. He begins to set this particular, very vital portion, the intro, up to where he wants to go. Very connected to his ability to forward information. And he goes on to say, I pray God that none of us ever live again like this. No more. He said, they tell us of the Israelites in Egypt, the Helots in Sparta, and the Roman slaves, which were made up from almost every nation under the earth, whose suffering under those ancient heathen nations were in comparison with ours under this enlightened Christian nation, a cipher, in other, just words. Those heathen nations of antiquity, but little more than a name, while wretchedness and endless misery were reserved apparently to be poured upon our fathers, ourselves and our children, by this Christian crowd. So David Walker in himself, a Christian man, begins to forward this information and ask for those slaves. Now, he aimed this particular piece at the slaves themselves, but he took the idea of holding the northern so-called abolitionists accountable, as well as the southern Christian slave owner. He is speaking directly to different groups, and he's forwarding this information uncompromisingly, very historically accurate, and needed more than anything at this particular time. He says, the positions that I shall endeavor, with the help of the Lord, demonstrate the course of this appeal. Almighty God, who is our Father, will open our hearts to understand and believe this truth. So now, David Walker is forwarding this information. He's allowing those who want to stick up for the idea of slavery and call themselves Christians. He connects with them. He holds them accountable, feet to the fire. He also forwards this to the northern abolitionists, or those who are anti-slavery. And let us get that together right now. The idea, the difference between someone being of anti-slavery thought and an abolitionist thought. An abolitionist, well, let's go with the anti-slavery. Anti-slavery wants no slavery, but no equal rights. The abolitionist, no slavery with equal rights. So if we see where this is set up in this particular part of the world, then you question the idea of what Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, really was. Did Abraham Lincoln read David Walker's appeal? There are lots of things that we can look to and question, but we want to make sure that David Walker's looked to in the light of a genius during history, because 9 times out of 10 he'll be written out of history if it were not for our small time that we have here. 9 times out of 10 he'll be taken incorrectly, misunderstood. So he says, the causes, my brother, which produce our wretchedness and miseries are so very numerous and aggravating that I believe only the pen of a Josephus or a Plutarch can enumerate them and explain them. So he connects to the Greeks. This is brilliantly written. And he says that I am fully aware in making this appeal to my much afflicted and suffering brethren that I should not only be assailed by those whose greatest earthly desires to keep us in abject ignorance and wretchedness, who are the firm conviction that heaven has designed us and our children to be slaves and a beast of burden for them and their children eternally. I say that I do not only expect to be held in the public as ignorant, impudent, and a restless disturber of the peace, a mover of insubordination, and perhaps put to prison or death for giving to expose our miseries and exposing the tyrants. Now, as David Walker's words reverberate, David Walker appeal is found written in 1829. David Walker dies of some very, very funny or peculiar circumstances, what some say was a aneurysm, in 1831, right outside his home in Boston, Massachusetts. I had the pleasure and the privilege to travel to study transcendentalism the summer of 2013 and got a chance to go to David Walker's home, entered David Walker's home and got a chance to do some filming. But David Walker in himself, he dies in 1831, and the idea of David Walker dying in 1831, his appeal living on, then we can go straight to the idea of Nat Turner's insurrection, which took place 1831, Southampton County, Virginia. If you understand Massachusetts and Virginia, and you understand that coastline, that was indeed found. David Walker's appeal was indeed found with the great prophet Nat Turner. So when we speak of these particular historical accuracies, and then we wonder, why isn't David Walker more of American society's history? Why isn't David Walker's appeal mandated for young African-American children in schools to read so they can have a hero who looked just like them? Well, the idea of miseducation versus education, or we talk about the study of blacks versus black studies, which falls under historiosis, then we know that David Walker or Nat Turner won't be painted in a proper light by anyone other than someone who has the fortitude to talk about these people as heroes. You will never hear Nat Turner's name spoken outside of Black American historians who happen to be so-called radicals to mention him as a prophet. And indeed he was, as well as David Walker's appeal. I've heard some very wise scholars say that David Walker, the way that he went about forwarding the information was wrong. I do not have time nor the interest in wrestling with historians who have their own thoughts. I agree wholeheartedly that David Walker's appeal was indeed historical, and that's as far as I will go with about arguing. His importance is what we can speak of today. So to take a young black child in a public school and forward the information about David Walker's appeal, about Nat Turner, would indeed be backwards or juxtaposed of what formal education has taught or what its aim is. So to find David Walker, to find Nat Turner, look to anything other than someone who was a monster, connects by those who will forward this information as teachers, as scholars, as historians, and as writers. So Dr. Bobby Wright says it very well. when we look to our history, we make a vital mistake when we allow or when we take the position of using white Western European definitions to explain black phenomena. That is in itself a trick bag. So not to mention David Walker, prior to Nat Turner, as it goes historically forward to talk about transcendentalism and Emerson and Thoreau and Garrison and Frederick Douglass as important people, you have to understand Garrison himself was looked to as a radical. Frederick Douglass was looked to as a radical. And transcendentalism was looked to as a radical piece. Emerson and Thoreau. Emerson and Thoreau, transcendentalism. Very important part, which leads us up to a very important part of history, which leads us up to the Compromise of 1850. And when we talk about the Compromise of 1850, one thing that sticks out is the Fugitive Slave Act. That wasn't the very first Fugitive Slave Act. The very first Fugitive Slave Act was 1793, which, if we can separate the two, 1793's Fugitive Slave Act could be looked to as more local or state control or anti-federal through the thought of anti-federalists. And we look to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to be more of a federalist thought. This goes to show you that these particular slaves were in no means satisfied with the role of being subhuman, so they ran. And there was a doctor in Louisiana, Dr. Cartwright, and Dr. Cartwright came up with a term for the disease that a slave had when they ran away. It's called drapetomania. Now that's a very hard word to pull apart or even look up. But Dr. Samuel Cartwright from Louisiana called it drapetomania, meaning that this person had some sort of problem with running away. And they had problems not with just running away, they had problems with being slaves and less than subhuman. So we have had all kinds of definitions forwarded about what and how and when this particular thought came along, or the idea of the runaway slave, or the idea of the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, when we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act, what the Fugitive Slave Act did was put a monetary value on the runaway slave. So what it did was it created an industry of slave catchers, which was all along a lucrative business. So when we understand that the Fugitive Slave Act was only one portion of the Compromise of 1850, we can go backwards, and it's indeed proper to teach history in an inverted order. We understand clearly that the Fugitive Slave Act was tied into David Walker's appeal. We understand that the Fugitive Slave Act was indeed tied into the laws that were tied into Nat Turner's insurrection. We indeed understand the way that it forwarded fear, David Walker's appeal, the way that it forwarded fear, the idea of Nat Turner's insurrection. And there are a couple of folks that we need to mention. Gabriel Prosser, who was indeed planning an insurrection. So when the history is written, we find very rarely that we talk about these people in a light other than mentioning them and not telling the story in a scholarly manner. So that was the idea. But this scholarly manner needs to tie to those of you all who will only be able to catch this on TV or catch it auditorily, those who will not read, who will not research. And that's not for all of us, especially it's not fervent for all of us. So to be able to forward this is indeed important. And the youngest one who happens to be watching is the most important. The idea of talking about David Walker and Nat Turner is indeed so that the young population can indeed battle some of the historical dictums, or what that book called The Lies My History Teacher Told. It will be indeed my duty, because I am second generation, to understand its importance. Yes, my father's 82 years old, still teaching the light of understanding under the searchlight of truth. So when we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act, it indeed put a monetary value on returning the slave. $5 to free the slave, $10 to return the slave to slavery. So when you see the movie, 13 Years a Slave, not so accurate, it was more than 20 years that Solomon Northup suffered as a free man under slavery. And I'm so glad that there was the story that was told, but we have to be very careful about who tells the story. Dr. John Hope Franklin, another wise man that we've quoted already, he said there must be a distinguishing difference between what has happened and what those who have written said happened. So the idea of forwarding this information for those of you all who will happen to get a chance to see this is all about exposure. Our aim is to expose. Our aim is to forward you heroes that look just like you. Our aim is to get you to Google these things because that is your means of research nowadays, which is okay. It's better than not researching at all. Of course, we want you to go and read a book about it. But if you got the e-book online, then take full advantage of it. Study David Walker's appeal. Study the idea of Nat Turner's insurrection. Study the idea of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey. These are indeed heroes. These are people who have been written out of history on purpose for those who will continue to use status quo as a means for control, a connection to white supremacy, which is indeed a part of what we know as our educational system. So when you find out a little bit more about yourself, then maybe we can, as a group, improve our next generation. And that is indeed the goal, to make the next generation far better than we are right now. I can tell you that I really do believe that David Walker's appeal was God sent. There's absolutely no way we would still be talking about it right now if it didn't have relevance. And it is a classic. And my definition of a classic is as relevant today as the day it was written. If you pick that appeal up and read the preamble, just the preamble, you will see so many things that are tied into what we are going through today and the way that blacks treat each other today. I have to tell you that this has been a very special time that we've had together. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends and foes alike, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglass Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you.